Fulton J. Sheen, God and Intelligence. Chapter 10. The Value of the Non-Intellectual Approach to God. Contemporary thought is quite unanimous on the point that God is not reached by a rational or discursive process. None are found so intellectually poor to do reverence to the proofs for the existence of God, apart from the general prejudice against an intellectualist philosophy. One of the principal objections against the proofs is their abstract nature, or what Professor Schiller and Professor Beckwith have erroneously called their a priori nature. They are too dry, too scholastic, too rational. This criticism must in great part be conceded to be true. There is perhaps nothing colder in the whole realm of philosophy than the respondeo dicendum of the Summa. There is not throughout this whole work a single appeal to emotion, such as one finds, for example, in St. Augustine. The 5 ways of proving the existence of God make but little appeal to the heart, and are sorry rhetoric for the multitude. But much of the objection against the scholastic position would disappear if a distinction were kept in mind. Is the proof of the existence of God, as given in a scholastic manual or in the Summa, the exact representation of the way in which man arrives at the knowledge of God, or is it a fuller and more explicit statement? Is it for scientific or for popular consumption? Is it the result of immediate or of reflex knowledge? To answer these questions by reaffirming the second alternative is to have the objections. Because the chemist knows oil of vitriol by its formula, there is no reason why the man in the street should complain that science is destructive. Scientific language is adaptive to science. The 5 ways of proving the existence of God are adapted to philosophy. By the same logic, by which we reject the proofs because of their dry abstract nature, we should reject the science of chemistry because it symbolizes the very water we drink at the dinner table. The proofs in the Summa are the result of reflex knowledge. Thanks to his spiritual soul, man reflects on himself. He can know a thing, and know that he knows a thing, but he knows the thing before examining his knowledge of it. He knows directly and spontaneously before knowing reflectively. The distinction is not between 2 different kinds of knowledge. There is here merely a distinction of degree. Really, the proofs which the plain man gives are in principle the same as those of the angelic doctor. The difference lies in their manner of expression. The 5 arguments in the Summa are the result of reflection. They are the explicit definition and clear exposition of the spontaneous proofs of the ordinary person. Thus, the criticism of proofs by an appeal to their abstract nature is irrelevant. In the supposed revolt against all this abstractness, religious experience is said to be free from rigid formalism. Its value remains to be determined. From the outset, however, it is well to remember that the religious experience is only a new name for old ways of thinking. It has by no means sprung from modern philosophy alone. During the patristic period, it was known as cognito naturalis, incerta innata, and the like. During the scholastic period, it was known as confused or common knowledge. Confused knowledge, for the scholastic, is that by which something is known without analysis or the discernment of its parts or its predicates. Thus it is not sufficient to distinguish one object from other objects. Distinct knowledge, on the other hand, is that by which something is known through the analysis or the discernment of its parts or predicates. It therefore serves to differentiate one object from another. Religious experience is thus really to be identified at its best with the confused knowledge of the scholastics. Now, confused knowledge is at least of two kinds. In its operations, it may prescind altogether from reason and based itself upon the inclination of nature in the search for goodness. Or it may be intellectual, a kind of immediate inference or brush with reality, which is not further specified nor clarified. Now, the first of these two kinds of confused knowledge bears a close resemblance to the modern religious experience in its non-rational character. The second has only this in common with crude religious experience, that both profess to be immediate. But how both differ from the modern notion will be made clear later. The first kind of confused knowledge, it has been said, is found on the inclinations of nature. St. Thomas states his doctrine as follows: every creature, whether rational or irrational, or even inanimate, loves God above all things according to the kind of love which can properly belong to it. Hence it applies not only to man and to angels, but even to the lower creatures according as they love sensibly or naturally. By natural love is here understood the inclination of a being towards its end, in every tendency, in every inclination, in every urge. It is God who is sought, whether it be the stone obeying the law of gravitation or the seraphim burning in adoration. The principle underlying the doctrine is simply this: the whole is greater and more powerful than any of its parts. In other words, the motive forces of all our actions is the whole. Every action is just a part vision of the whole. We indeliberately expose our arm to ward off a blow in order to save the whole body. The citizen exposes his life for the good of the state. Now, as God is the common good of the whole universe, it follows that every creature implicitly desires and tends towards him in every act. The particular good is sought because it participates in divine likeness. In the lower orders, this natural love of God, based on the tendency towards the common good, is not voluntary or affective. It is natural, however. The young ravens, for example, may truly be said to call upon God on account of their natural desire for the divine goodness, according to their mode of being. They desire God implicitly, without knowing him, or perhaps, more correctly, interpretative. What is true of the lower order is true equally of man. He may act consciously in view of the whole. In desiring existence, he is desiring that which resembles God, and therefore is implicitly desiring God. In desiring even a sensible good, he is desiring God in some way. In fact, he cannot do otherwise. His will has a certain determination about it. It is free in its exercise, but determined in its specification. It is never determined to choose this particular good, but it is determined to choose the good. In seeking evil, even, he does so sub specie boni. By the very fact that we are on the quest of perfection, we are seeking God. If we may anticipate a reason for this, it is that we are made in the image and likeness of God. But unlike inorganic things, we are both living and conscious. We are like artists, constantly retouching our portraits to make them better correspond to the original exemplar. In the words of St. Augustine, we are frightened when we fail to imitate the original. We burn with the success of our imitation. God, then, is very close to us. In a certain sense, God is innate, not, of course, by his nature, but by his likeness, because all is desired after the likeness of the divine goodness, and all is known after the likeness of divine truth. But man, in virtue of his spiritual soul, becomes attached to God by even stronger bonds. The capacity to know, it will be recalled, increases with freedom from matter. But the soul of man, being spiritual, is free from all matter. It can therefore know all things, however imperfectly. It follows then that the soul is in essential relation to God, because it can attain the universal reason of all being and the goodness of being. But though the mind is capable of conceiving being in all its latitude, it actually finds itself in the order of the finite, the phenomenal, the material. There is no creature which it sees or knows or loves which exhausts its capacity for being, truth, goodness, and beauty. It is characterized by a radical resistance to limitation. Experience of the world leaves our hunger unassuaged. As the angelic doctor has put it, nothing finite can give rest to the urge of the intellect. In presence of something finite, it pushes out beyond. Every desire, unless it be spiritual, can be enjoyed in its plenitude in this life. Hence the natural tendency to transcend phenomena, to give rest to our spiritual yearnings. The mind sees the disproportion between its capacity and its realization, vaguely and confusedly, but necessarily. It sees its adequate object as possible. It knows in some way that created being does not exhaust its possibilities, and so it moves onward to its real object. Prior to any act of reason, men know happiness and seek their many visions of the good. Confusedly, implicitly, however dimly, in so doing, they seek after God, the supreme good, and thus have a knowledge of God, not as He is in Himself, but in confuso. There is a more definite kind of religious experience in the Thomistic thought than the above mentioned. It is a reasoning process, it is true, but of a very desultory and spontaneous kind. It is the reasoning attitude upon the application of the first principles of knowledge to the things of the universe. It is congenital and natural knowledge, and just as universal in its extent as the desire for happiness. By it all men can easily come to a knowledge of the existence of God. It is a kind of knowledge that is independent of social environment, and it functions without any education or aid of authority. It is even more readily attainable than the knowledge of worldly sciences. For if they were able to know so much as to make a judgment of the world, how did they not more easily find out the Lord therefore? It is logical conclusion, so spontaneous in its character that it happens almost in spite of ourselves. In the last chapter, it was stated that there are certain conclusions which attach themselves immediately to the first principle of the speculative and the practical intellect, such as causality and finality. They are the common heritage of all men without exception. Their expression may be crude, and is so with the generality of mankind, but this in no way affects their necessary or universality. The why of the child is his own simple way of expressing the principle of sufficient reason. These first principles, striking the visible thing of the world, are immediately reflected back to some first principle. As an object may be seen reflected in a mirror, so too God may be seen reflected in the mirror of the universe by the light of these first principles. Or the universe may be looked upon as on a book in which we read our knowledge of God. Immediately on intellectually perceiving that the world is moved, the intelligence by a sort of reflex action infers the existence of a mover. From the laws which govern it, or from the laws which govern mankind, the reason infers the existence of a legislator. From the beauty of the universe, it infers the existence of a supreme archetypical beauty. From the order of the universe, the mind concludes to some governor. From any of the transcendentals, it is reflected back to a cause or archetype of these transcendentals. As St. Thomas has put it, by natural reason man immediately comes to some knowledge of God, seeing that natural things change in an orderly fashion, and knowing that there can never be order without someone who orders. He perceives that there must be some governor of the general order of things. The result of this confused and immediate knowledge, as St. Thomas calls it, is a series of predicates, there being no mixed formula to which the confused knowledge attaches itself. God may be designated as the being of all beings, the first mover, the lawgiver, the authority of the moral law, the supreme good, truth, or beauty. But in every case it is a predicate which is convertible with God. It is to the application of these first principles to the visible things of the world that the historian of religion must go if he would give an ultimate explanation of the universal cult of God. Because of their fundamental nature and the easy and even spontaneous response which they evoke, St. Paul considers the failure of the pagan Romans to know God to be inexcusable. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. His eternal power also and divinity, so that they are inexcusable. Romans I:20. The knowledge which is given is not proper to a Christian any more than to a pagan. It is universal. This confused knowledge of which we are now speaking is imperfect. But small though it be, even the least knowledge which we can have of God is worth more than all the knowledge we can have of creatures. Much that has been written about instinct, desire, and the like can be accepted if understood as identical with confused knowledge. Professor Alexander, for example, insists that we have an appetite for God, just as we have an appetite for food. The angelic doctor might well have been quoted in support of the position when he writes in De Malo, "Man desires divine similitude by a natural appetite." The Manchester's professor at times describes the confused knowledge in such terms as these, which are perfectly acceptable. When we ask how we come by the nature of God, we must answer that as we love and hate and appetite and aversion, it is because the world provokes in us a certain response, which makes us aware. In no matter how primitive a form of God, the same approval is to have given to the knowledge of explanation of Professor Beckwith, the Professor Spaulding, in the above sense. From Professor Beckwith says, for example, belief in God is not innate, but the tendency to such belief is constant and the inexpugnable structure of our consciousness. He is unconsciously giving the translation of a response in the commentary of the sentence of Peter Lombard. The Professor Spaulding, even more than the others, gives an excellent description of this confused notion as a desire which pushes the soul on until it comes to perfect existence. Thus, when God is attained, no desire can exceed a desire of him. The scholastic who insists that the primary element in religious experience is intellectual is immediately met with the objection that the intellect never works alone. Modern philosophy, Mr. Davidson has told us, affected in part by biology, has worked out the fruitful notion of mind as an organic unity, and consequently has insisted on the fact that the intellect or reason does not stand alone, but is in most imminent relation with feeling and willing. The objection falls into line with the general attack on scholasticism as the solidifier of the real. Modern philosophy, affected in part by biology, in insisting on the unity of mind, has merely rediscovered that which has been generally admitted through the centuries. St. Thomas, for example, makes it quite clear in his Treatise of Mind that the act of knowledge, strictly so called, is not of the intelligence but of the soul. The mind means something much more than the reason. It embraces the memory, the intelligence, and the will. In a word, all the potencies which in their acts are free from material conditions. Closely associated with the intellectual element in religious experience is a second, the affective. They have a repercussion on one upon the other. Hence, when the intelligence attains its object, even confusedly, the soul responds effectively. In a certain sense, there is no knowledge of the real without some affective process, because man seeks the truth with his whole soul. The above brief analysis of the elements of scholastic religious experience will be more clearly thrown into relief in contrasting them with three possible errors which may arise. The first is to make the affective state primitive in religious experience and the cause of the intellectual state. The second is to make this type of experience the criterion of the primitive data concerning God. The third is to make the reflex intellectual knowledge merely secondary and accidental in the development of our knowledge of God. The intellectual element is not primitive in the modern account of religious experience. That which gives us God is according to it some experience, some synthetic affection, instinct, imagination, or faith state. In a word, it is by emotion that we mount up to the all-inclusive reality. The emotional attitude is non-intellectual and carries its own assurance in its own state, or its warmth in the complete satisfaction which the emotion supplies. The knowledge of God is the result of this emotion. It is the affective state which begets God. By an extension of the principle, such theories as those of desire and hypothesis may be grouped under this class, since something non-intellectual is the fons et origo of the certitude. Apart from the agnostic and pantheistic prejudice which often underlies these theories, they are for other reasons philosophically untenable. In opposition to the errors stated above, we may lay down three principles. 1. The affective religious state presupposes the intellectual coefficient. 2. Religious experience is not a criterion of the primitive data about God, whether those data are an affective state or an hypothesis or a faith state. 3. Intellectual elaboration is necessary and essential. 1. Affective religious state presupposes the intellectual coefficient. Some elements of the religious experience, in the broad sense of the term, have been traced through all the hierarchies of creation. All creatures, from the stone to the angel, fundamentally tend towards God, however indirectly. In seeking their end, they are seeking God. But this tendency, or inclination, or desire, or movement, presupposes throughout the whole extent of these orders a cognitive state. If the knowledge does not exist in the thing itself, it must exist in some one outside itself who gave it its nature. The error does not know its mark, nor does it tend to its mark unless some one directs it. The orders of being below man do not know their end. They are directed to it by God. In the animal there is a natural movement to its end, which is due to sense knowledge. In man the movement is due to his intellectual knowledge. Man cannot will anything, love anything, tend towards anything, have a faith state towards anything, unless he knows the thing. With even far greater force than in the lower kingdoms the law applies. Knowledge underlies every movement. The affective state, in its turn, presupposes knowledge. In its nature, it is a reaction. It presupposes something which causes the reaction, that is, an object presented either by the senses or by the intellect. The affective state, therefore, belongs only when the intellectual operation is terminated. It is borne towards the object of knowledge in order to hold it, as it were, in such a way as to render unnecessary the retracing of the steps by which the knowledge was gained. An affective state of a son for his mother, for example, dispenses him from reviewing the intellectual procedure which begat that affection. In this sense, it may be said that the habits of the affective part of man act as a remote principle of knowledge, inasmuch as they elicit acts by which the intellect knows them. But to subvert this order and to make antecedent what by its nature is consequent is to destroy the very nature of the thing. Emotion never creates but presupposes knowledge. Solomon has lived immortally for refusing to admit that emotion could create truth. The guilty woman who appeared before him showed far more emotion than the innocent mother. The guilty woman tried to make emotion create the truth. The innocent woman allowed truth to create emotion, and the truth made her free. There is a sentiment in religion, it is quite true. But because there is sentiment, it does not follow that the sentiment is primitive or that everything is sentiment. The affective state merely tells the direction. It does not tell what directs it. Feeling is important for religious belief, not in supplying its content or in supplanting its content, but in lending its strength. We may set the point at issue in the form of a question. It is argued that the affective state puts me in contact with him from whom saving experience comes, or again, that we have an instinct or a desire for God. But we must ask, why this instinct? Why this desire? Why does the affective state put me in contact with the invisible God? Why, in a word, is God the object of these states, or identified with them? Why is this object not evil, cosmic, suicide, or what you will? Why does God answer to need of these faculties more than the stars or the moon? Is it not because there is a certain proportionality between my intellect and the object as there is between the eye and a thing seen? Is it not because in a certain way we are predetermined by nature to depend upon God by a real relation, and God is predetermined to us by a logical relation? In other words, is it not because we were made for God, and hence only God can satisfy us? Furthermore, is not this power on the part of the object to satisfy us independent of our tendencies? The colored object which in point of fact satisfies the eye is independent of the tendency of the eye to see. By the very fact that the object calls the tendency into act, it does not depend for existence on the tendency. So too, by the very fact that God calls forth the tendency, the need, the desire, he does not depend on it. No faculty creates its own object. If there is a proportionality between ourselves and God, and this proportionality is independent of our making, some faculty is needed which can embrace an object of knowledge, proportional to both, inasmuch as the intellect is commensurate with being. It follows that the proportionality between God and man must be reduced to the faculty. Religious experience, then, as confused intellectual knowledge, puts us in contact with God, because it can grasp all being. No other faculty has an object with the same broad inclusiveness. Indeed, the very fact that the affective state is a function of the mental side of us excludes such contact as direct and primitive from the knowledge. From a denial of the priority of the intellectual element over the affective, certain consequences follow which render the modern theory of religious experience untenable. Whence comes the affective state? The sentiment of God, or the sense of something there? From ourselves? If so, we are God? From experience? If so, it has no greater value than any organic state. But experience can only approve or disapprove the reality of an object. It cannot produce or create an object. It is an objective flung at a substantive. Does it come from God? The affective state is organic. It is therefore personal and incommunicable, as are all the affective states. But if it is a personal and incommunicable, there follow two results. First, God will vary from person to person because no affective state is the same in two persons. Secondly, God will vary from experience to experience in the same person. When man is in a passion, something will seem good to him, which does not seem so when he is not in a passion. As taste depends upon a certain disposition of the tongue, so will God follow the disposition of the experiencer. It is precisely because the affective state vary from one philosopher to another that we have so many different gods in modern philosophy. Mr. Fauchet, for example, comes into contact with a divinal imaginal, Professor Alexander with a nisus, Mr. Holmes with a president of a cosmic commonwealth, James with a god in the dust, and Mr. Wells with a youth in the morning sun. There are as many gods as there are philosophers. Sir Henry Jones, speaking of this, pertinently remarks, "No ultimate law or principle can be operative only occasionally. To maintain that God is good now and then, and present and operative here and there, or that order rules the universe at times and in certain spots, while elsewhere contingencies are rampant and particulars run amok. All that seems to me as foolish as to say that 2 times 2 is 4, now and then on certain days and in certain places. Both the theory and the practice of religion demand for its sovereign authorities an unlimited domain. Then, too, with the same person, God will vary from one experience to another. Professor Leuba assures us that the validity of the religious states of consciousness is precisely the same as any other state of consciousness. They are absolutely undeniable only as long as they are considered merely as the experience of the subject and no longer. The affective state which gives us contact with God is climbing the Alps will not be that which we feel in a shipwreck, and will not give us the same kind of God. God will vary with our joys and our sorrows, our laughs and our tears, our fortunes and our misfortunes. There will be as many gods as there are varieties of religious experience. In every case we shall be worshipping at the shrine our own hands have made. God will become nothing more than the God we can use, which is equivalent to saying that there will be no God but ourselves. Such as God would be absolutely worthless as the foundation of any religion. He would be nothing more than a mere justification of our own mode of living. Instead of making our lives conform to dogmas, this view would make dogmas conform to our lives, but makes the foundation of our belief in God intellectual, and it is immediately removed from the vicissitudes of the affective life. God then becomes something more than a variant. He becomes a constant. Hence it is that God, as well as the credo of an intellectualist, are true independently of his affective states. God will have the same objective validity for us, whether we are contemplating a sunset or suffering in anguish. He will be above the needs of the age and the progress of biology, as every cause is above its effect. He will be the God who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, in contrast with the modern God found by any effective state, who will vary from forest to forest and from horizon to horizon. In conclusion, it may be said that the origin of the modern insistence on the effective state lies in the failure to distinguish confused from reflex knowledge. It is quite true that an effective state often precedes reflex knowledge, but it is never true that it precedes all knowledge. What modern philosophers call contact with God is really only a conclusion from the first principles drawn from the visible things of the universe. God is not the phenomenon which we perceive, rather, he is the ultimate cause which produces it. In a word, the whole modern position falls into an inconsistency. On the one hand, it declares it to be impossible for the intelligence to surpass experience and to reach God. On the other hand, it declares experience to be the royal route to Him. Certainly, if the organic and effective part of us, by which we are like unto animals, can attain God, then the intellectual part of us, by which we are like unto God, can attain Him. The doctrine which has just been exposed is the Thomistic statement of the primary importance of the intellect in the quest for God. As time goes on, thinkers are more and more coming back to the Thomistic notion. Mr. Flower of Oxford has admirably stated that the argument in these words, "To be reasonable is therefore as primary a duty in religion as to be passionate, emotional, or impulsive. It is not enough to feel good, to enjoy the aesthetics and emotional satisfactions and thrills which some forms of religion set themselves out to secure. Any belief that stimulates an instinctive tendency will, it is true, do for this. But for those to whom religion means something that does not make them feel good, but be and do good, it is essential to have beliefs which represent the nearest approach to truth we can make, which are, so to speak, outstretched hands grasping the reality of God and bringing to our life and its opportunities the wider vision of a divine purpose to be fulfilled. Emotion is apt to be misleading, but because the things in which we believe is also an object of desire, but because wanting it is apt to affect our mental processes and prevent us from looking at facts just as they are. The source of the trouble is not that we reason in terms of emotional objects, but that we reason in emotional ways, and so cannot get objects into their true perspective. To appeal to the emotions on questions where only reason and evidence are really relative is to build upon sand. 2. Experience cannot be the criterion on the primitive data about God, whether those data are given by an effective state or faith or as an hypothesis. Religious experience demands interpretation. There are to be certain standards by which it is to be judged. Among these are the needs of the individual, the needs of the age, or both, in the light of the theory of evolution. The practical idea, which has to be with life as it launches itself on the great venture of living, is the greatest of these determinations. Its conclusion is that the gods we stand by are the gods we need and can use. But all these standards by which religious experience is to be judged imply an act of the intelligence. Every judgment of value is intellectual. It supposes the non-empirical and the transcendental. The very assertion that there will be no intellectual dogma to judge religion is in itself an intellectual dogma. There is no dogma in the whole of the intellectual order more rigid than the dogma that we need no dogma. In denying its necessity, we are asserting it. The empirical test in itself is not in the intellectual order, it is true, but the reason for which we choose to use the empirical test is of the intellectual order. Evolution in itself is of the empirical order. But the reason for making the test of a religious experience falls within the scope of the intellect. Apart from this, there are certain inconsistencies in the modern criterion which cannot be explained away. For example, to make God depend on the particular value he may have for our lives is to subvert the relation between the end and the means. Health is not desirable on the account of the medicine. Otherwise, medicine is more desirable than health. Health is the end. Medicine is the means to the end. In like manner, God is not desirable because he may be of some use in our lives. He is not a means to the richer, fuller, and more satisfying life. He is the end of life, or rather, he is life. Nothing has any value for us unless it has a value in itself. God does not exist because he is useful for our lives. He is useful because he exists. His value for us is a consequence of his existence. His existence is not a consequence of his value. God is not good because he has a value for our lives. He has a value for our lives because he is good. Operatio sequitur esse. To make our experience in its finite mode of being the determinant of either the existence of God or his attributes is to suppose that God has no value whatever, except in relation to our puny selves, and that apart from this value for us, he is not worth knowing. It is very true to say that the tree shall be known by its fruits, but this must not make us oblivious of that which underlies this judgment, namely, the tree explains the fruits. The unity of religious doctrine, as M. Michelet has put it, can put in relief its superiority, but this utility finds its sufficient reason in the superiority of the doctrine. There will be no fruits unless the tree exists. Neither will there be any fruits of the idea of God unless God exists. To say, then, that the question, does God exist? How does he exist? What is he? Are so many irrelevant questions, is to say the absurd. There must be, at the outset, some intellectual data, even though that data be known only in confuso. This has been sufficiently insisted on to allow us to pass on the value of experience. God must be tested in the crucible of experience, is the assertion of modern philosophy. If he dignifies human character, adds reach and sanity to man's aims, alleviates and secures the life of man, and makes for peace and mutual helpfulness among the nations, then the proof of his existence is strong. Let us suppose the experience concerning God are multiplied indefinitely. Even suppose that all these experiences are spiritual. Represent the experience of the fact by SV, signifying spiritual value. Represent multiplication of this test indefinitely by SV, infinity. At the end of all my experiences, innumerous, varied, and multiplied as they may be, what have I? I merely have made experiments without gaining an increase in knowledge. To affirm a consent character of a common subject is mere repetition. There are arithmetical universality. There is multiplication of facts. Experience abounds, but there is no knowledge. The unity of the proposition depends on the unity of a thing designated. In the whole series of the facts, a different thing is designated inasmuch as there is a plurality of objects accidentally juxtaposed. The only way by which a unity within all these facts can be found is to reduce them to their specific unity by a dose of intellectual abstraction. It is a fact, for example, that hydrochloric acid decomposes into chlorine and hydrogen. This is a fact which may be multiplied indefinitely, but that which is not a fact but a law, and which is the work of the intelligence, is that hydrochloric acid is not homogeneous, as are its constituents. Here there is more than a mere sign representing a group of similar things. It is a law of fact, which ultimately has its foundation in one of the principles of being. To apply this to problem in point, experience as experience does not in the least affect our knowledge of God. 1,000 facts are no richer than 10 facts, as long as they are juxtaposed. Neither do multiplied spiritual experiences about God give us any knowledge of God. The intelligence must intervene with certain principles which will render these experiences intelligible. Our conclusion, then, is that a philosophy of experience without the work of intelligence is unintelligible. Grant now that the modern philosopher becomes intellectual to the point of accepting the necessary of an intellectual abstraction. The question now is, will experience verify our preconceived ideas? Will result make the idea true? Because results in the term towards which the idea leads us, will they constitute its truth? In other words, what is the value of modern faith? Is the judgment about God a candidate for the truth? In a word, are there cases where faith creates its own justification? As an illustration of this principle, the interesting example which James gave will be recalled. Our faith beforehand, he writes, in an uncertified result is the only thing that makes the result come true. If we have truth, we can jump the mountain abyss. We make that universe true by our faith, as we make it untrue by our mistrust. There is much bad logic hidden behind the example. Examples cover a multitude of sins. The example really proves the contrary of what James intended it to prove, the object of our faith or hypothesis in God. This corresponds to the other side of the abyss in the example given. Now, does the fact that I succeed in making the jump in the least affect the other side of the abyss? Certainly not. It is existent in anterior to my faith, as it is existent posterior to it, being in truth quite independent of it. My faith does not in the least verify its existence, as my failure to attain it does not in the least destroy its existence. My judgment of the object remains intact. What will be new will be my attitude of mind towards that relation. What is considered as hypothetical is now considered as perfectly well-founded. The relation between the judgment and the object has remained immutable, though our mind has a different view of it. The judgment which we make about God is confused intellectual knowledge remains unchanged. The verification which follows adds nothing to the content of the knowledge, just as the other side of the abyss continues to exist whether I succeed in making the leap or not. So God's existence remains unaffected by my mental attitude. The proposition which is at the abyss of this faith and of the Al-Ob philosophy is that there is a direct and general influence of ideas on things. It is true that ideas have influence on things indirectly. Our mental attitude or outlook does affect the things themselves, very much as smoke glasses affect the object of our vision. Hence the importance that St. Thomas attaches to the moral preparation as necessary for the perception of certain truths. But at the same time, there is danger of exaggeration. James is guilty of it in the example. It makes a condition a cause, and a quality a substance. If our mind has the power of modifying the real in virtue of that which it awakens, our physical activity would be useless, or at least it would play merely a secondary role in the transformation which we impose on things in order that they may satisfy us. It is a fact beyond all dispute that to conceive or to will energetically does not make things correspond to our thoughts and desires. Hunger has never been satisfied by an idea of bread. If ideas reveal reality, there is no need of verifying them. Hence the great importance which Thomistic realism lays upon the doctrine that by ideas we do not rest in photographs, but attain to the very things themselves. That which we know is the object, not the idea of the object. It is only by reflex act that we know the idea. When two concepts united by the verb to be imply one another reciprocally, a thing cannot be and not be viewed under the same formal aspect. We have no need to go to experience to know that this is true of the reality. Only where this necessary connection between the subject and the predicate is lacking is there need to go to experience. The philosophy which makes the idea of God true, if the consequences are good, confuses the true and the good. The error is not that truth is made to consist in the nature of such and such a consequence, but rather that the good is presented as the mark of the true, or as the constituent of the true. In the good, the dispositions of the subject enter in as an essential element. It is good to sit near a fire when the weather is cold, but not when it is warm. The same cannot be said of the true. It is independent of the dispositions of the subject. Furthermore, by the good we are drawn to the thing. By truth, the thing is drawn toward us. By the appetitive faculties, the soul is related to the things as they are in themselves. The good supposes the true, as desire supposes knowledge, and as the inclination supposes a reason for the tendency. The idea of God's existence is not the true because it succeeds practically. It succeeds practically because He exists. And we will continue this chapter at our next sitting.